It's been 1 year in office for the 46th President of the United States. Joe Biden promised to build back better, but with America as divided as ever, how much has he really achieved? Some say it's just typical in judging presidents for expectations to just be too high. Is that fair with Joe Biden, or is he just doing a very average job so far?
I think the bigger issue for Joe Biden going into the second year is what is he going to do now? Because he does have a couple significant wins on the board. But what is it that the American people are really focused on now? They're focused on COVID, and they're focused on inflation and the broader economy. And what has Joe Biden spent the last month or so really talking about? It's been about voting rights, and it's been about Build Back Better, which nobody knows what goes into the Build Back Better. Right? So if Joe Biden shifts that focus, he's going to have, obviously, voting rights is very important. We could talk about the difference, right, between voter suppression and voter subversion. And it looks like that the whole Congress now is going to focus on voter subversion, which is a real critical issue. But if Congress can take care of that, if Biden in the second year can get COVID back to where it should be in terms of testing and in terms of keeping the schools open, and if he can focus on the economy as much as a president can, it's unfair in a way, and if he can focus on that, he can have a really good second year. And you saw him pivot to those things in the press conference today when he started talking about, let's break up Build Back Better and let's pass what we can.
But is that the case with Joe Biden? Because he made a point of saying that he really only intended on taking on one term. And many thought that whoever he chose as his vice president was going to be the next candidate. We're not seeing that kind of relationship develop where he's putting Kamala Harris out front to make the U.S. public comfortable with her kind of taking the reins when he is supposed to kind of step aside in 3 more years. What's going on there? And I mean, could this work against the Democratic Party?
Well, let's look at where we were a year ago, right? We had just had an armed insurrection on the Capitol with deaths. We did not know going into Inauguration Day whether there was going to be more violence in Washington, D.C. We had COVID was rampaging through the country. And that's the situation Joe Biden had to deal with this year. We don't have that anymore. So it's a whole different ballgame now in terms of where he is. And we need to judge him on what he inherited and where to go forward. In terms of being the oldest president ever elected, look, he is really the first president maybe in history where there's a question on day one whether he's going to run for a second term. And so because of his age. And so that's something that has to be navigated. When it comes to the Biden-Harris relationship, I think, Kamala Harris is one of the first vice presidents ever to become vice president with less Washington experience than her boss. And because of that, she doesn't bring to the vice presidency what Biden brought to the vice presidency for Obama, what Cheney brought for Bush, what Gore brought for Clinton, and on and on and on. So they have to feel those things through. You're seeing a retooling and a resetting a bit of what the vice president is going to do. And the question will have to answer itself after the midterms if President Biden is going to seek a second term. So what he's got to focus on now is resetting for year 2, resetting for an era of inflation and getting it done.
Steve, quickly, I just want to give 1 minute to, I want to go back to foreign affairs, actually, foreign policy on behalf of the Biden administration. I addressed Afghanistan with Mitch. We had heard mention of the Paris Climate Accord. That promise was immediately delivered on. He has done a little bit less regarding joining the JCPOA again, the Iran nuclear accord. But how much does that really matter to the U.S. public in judging his success so far?
Look, I'm going to be very flip. It really doesn't matter in terms of foreign policy. We're sitting here in Singapore. He's got a trilemma he has to deal with. What is going to happen with U.S.-China relations? That's still basically no further along than it was a year ago. What's going to happen with the Indo-Pacific economic strategy? He's got very good alliances going with Japan and Australia and India, but nothing concrete to show for it. And he has to figure out what to do, especially with Southeast Asia, which is caught between the U.S. and China. This is a year he's going to need of action in terms of foreign policy. It's extremely important to the U.S. from a geostrategic perspective, somewhat from an economic perspective, but look, not really from a political perspective in terms of influencing the midterms or whether or not he's going to get reelected.
Okay. I'll tell you what, I want to move forward because we are less than a year away from midterm elections, and it's looking a bit bleak, actually, for Democrats at the moment. We have a stalled legislative agenda. There's some losses over the pandemic, and the lack of a clear political strategy have kind of set alarm bells ringing within the Democratic Party. So deep racial and economic divides are also continuing to plague the country. And then to top it off, we've got Biden's attempts to pass a bill protecting voting rights that actually failed. Steve, go ahead.
Look, here's how the scenario under which the Democrats win. And to get to your Supreme Court decision, if the Supreme Court outlaws, outright overturns Roe v. Wade, and the right to choose is eliminated as a federal right and goes away in dozens and dozens of states, that is going to mobilize Democratic voters. And there's a real possibility that this Republican-appointed majority Supreme Court could do that. If that happens, and at the same time, the economy improves because inflation does come down, but you keep unemployment low. COVID gets to a much lower level, and the Democrats can pass popular things in the Congress, like climate change, like providing universal pre-K. If the Democrats can do all of those things, and boy, that's pulling an inside straight, but if they can do that, yeah, the Democrats have a chance